The sky above Taros, 9 burned with the amber hues of dusk, its twin suns bleeding light over a city suffocating under its own weight. Towering foundries belched smoke into the thick air, their relentless hum drowning out all but the sharpest sounds. Metal and fire ruled this world. The ground trembled with the echoes of industry, and the people, if they could still be called that, moved through the streets like ghosts, hollow-eyed and silent. Mira Ardent pulled the rust-stained scarf tighter over her face, more out of habit than necessity. The dust clung to her skin, the scent of scorched iron and burnt oil thick in her lungs. She moved with precision, her pace carefully calculated, not too slow, not too fast. Hesitation could be as dangerous as haste. The overseers had eyes everywhere, and the Sarthians were not known for mercy. She had learned these rules young, learned them in the way a child learns to breathe, through necessity rather than instruction. She had survived this long by knowing when to be seen and when to disappear, when to speak and when to let silence be her armor. They called it an empire, but to Mira, it was a machine. One that consumed everything and left nothing but gears and cogs in its wake. The Sarthian Dominion had taken Earth over 300 years ago, though "taken" was a polite word for what had really happened. There were no great battles, no heroic last stands, no flashing red alerts screaming of imminent invasion, no armies swarming across city streets with thunderous weapons and marching boots. That was not the Sarthian way. They had crushed humanity with a whisper instead of a scream. First they bought Earth. Not with blood, but with promises. Better technology, better medicine, an end to hunger, an end to war. A few treaties, a few well-placed bribes, a few handshakes in sealed rooms where the fate of billions was reduced to numbers on a ledger. By the time Earth's leaders realized what they had signed away, it was done. When the Dominion finally revealed its true face, there was no need for destruction. Earth had already been assimilated. Its industries, its governments, its people. The chains had been fastened long before anyone saw them. And now, humanity was not a conquered people. That would imply there had ever been a fight. They were workers, clerks, entertainers, merchants. Useful, but never equal. The Sarthians did not kill those who resisted. That would be inefficient. Instead, they simply erased them. Names vanished from records, homes reassigned, families restructured. People learned not to ask what had happened to a missing neighbor. A name not spoken was a name that had never existed. Fear was cleaner than blood, and the Dominion preferred efficiency above all else. Mira had seen what happened to those who thought themselves rebels. And yet, her grandfather's voice still whispered in her mind, an echo of the man who had raised her after her parents were reassigned. He had told her of a time when humans measured their own hours, dictated their own fate, lived by their own laws. A time when their names still mattered. She didn't know if she believed in that past. Didn't know if she believed in anything anymore. But she knew this much. If the Sarthians had taken humanity without war, then war would never be the way to take it back. Humans didn't win through battle. They infiltrated. They adapted. They became indispensable. They would tear the machine apart from within. The market was as crowded as ever, a sea of tired faces moving through narrow pathways lined with stalls of ration goods and black market wares. The Dominion enforcers stood on their elevated platforms, golden armor gleaming under artificial lights, eyes scanning for anything that hinted at disruption. The Sarthians stood apart, as they always did, their elongated forms draped in ceremonial silk, silvered eyes half-lidded with detached disinterest. They did not rule through force. They did not patrol the streets or bark orders. They simply existed above it all, untouchable, unconcerned. Myra's path was carefully chosen. She did not stray too close to the overseers, nor did she linger long enough at any one stall to attract notice. She moved like a shadow that belonged, present but unremarkable. And yet, something pulled her to a small stand tucked into the edge of the market, where an old merchant had arranged his wares in neat rows. Tools, scraps of metal, broken data slates. Junk. Useless in a world that ran on Dominion technology. Her hand rested on a watch. It was ancient, a relic of Earth's past. The glass was cracked, the hands frozen at a time long forgotten. To anyone else, it was worthless. To Mira it was proof. This was not a mistake. Someone had left this here. Someone who knew what it meant. She placed more credits on the counter than necessary. The merchant, An older man with eyes that had seen too much said nothing. He only nodded once, a slow and deliberate motion, a silent acknowledgement that they were no longer strangers. Mira pocketed the watch and vanished back into the moving tide of bodies. She had what she came for. Not the watch. The message hidden inside it. She did not yet know who had left it. She only knew one thing. The chains they had forged for humanity had begun to rust. Mira walked quickly, keeping her head low as she moved through the dense streets of Taros 9. The watch felt heavier than it should in her pocket, as if time itself had been packed into its tiny, shattered frame. It was not the object that unsettled her, but the intent behind it. Someone had left it there for her. Someone who knew enough to understand that she would recognize its significance. But who? The thought nagged at her as she weaved through the crowd, past stalls filled with rationed grain and synthetic meat, past groups of weary workers exchanging hushed conversations before the night curfew descended. A city built on labor never truly slept, but after dark, it belonged to them. The overseers, the enforcers, the silent eyes of the Sarthian Dominion. She took a narrow side street where the dim glow of the street lamps barely reached, where the air smelled of rust and old rain. The Undercity. The parts of Taros 9 that the Dominion did not bother to maintain, where the bones of the old world still jutted through the surface of the new. Her destination was just ahead, a small dwelling wedged between two industrial buildings, its metal walls patched with scrap and insulation salvaged from forgotten places. She knocked twice, then a third time, the rhythm deliberate. A pause. A test. The door clicked open. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of oil and burnt circuitry. Wires coiled like metal vines along the walls, connecting old-world tech to new Dominion scraps in ways that should not have worked, yet somehow did. In the center of it all, bent over a disassembled console, was Ronan Voss. "You're late," he muttered, not looking up. His hands worked deftly, his fingers stained with grease. Mira pulled the watch from her pocket and set it on the table. "I found this." That made him stop. Ronan was not the type to waste movement. He turned, dark eyes scanning her face before dropping to the watch. His jaw tightened. "Where?" "Market. Merchant stand." It wasn't random. "No," he agreed, lifting the timepiece with a care one might afford a fragile relic. "It never is." Mira crossed her arms, waiting. Ronan had always known more than he said. He was a fixer, a scavenger, someone who could make Dominion tech do things it was never designed to do. But he was also a historian in his own way, a collector of lost knowledge. If anyone could decipher the meaning behind this, it was him. He turned the watch over, pried at the cracked glass with a small tool from his belt. Something inside clicked. The second hand twitched. Mira took a step closer. "You were right," he murmured. He angled the watch toward the dim light, revealing what lay beneath the surface. Not gears, not springs, a microdata chip. Her breath hitched. "That's pre-Dominion." Ronan nodded. "Old Earth tech. A message, maybe. Coordinates. Could be anything." The weight in Myra's chest deepened. This was not a simple token. Someone had risked everything to plant this message. And whoever they were, they had known Mira would find it. "Can you extract it?" she asked. Ronan exhaled sharply. "That depends. Do you want it done clean, or do you want it done now?" She hesitated. "If it was left for me, then we don't have time for clean." A grim smile tugged at the corner of Ronan's mouth. "That's what I thought." He turned, moving to a battered workbench littered with tools and stripped Dominion components. He retrieved a reader unit, a clunky, outdated device pieced together from at least 5 different origins. It beeped as he inserted the chip. Mira leaned in, tension threading through her muscles. The screen flickered, then stabilized. A single sentence appeared. "It's still ours." Silence stretched between them, heavy and unspoken. Myra's pulse pounded. Ronan spoke first, his voice low. "I know that phrase." Her fingers curled into fists. "From where?" He met her gaze. "My father. He used to say it when I was a kid. He said it was the last thing the old world sent out before the Dominion took control. A transmission, broadcast on every human channel, every network. Just those words. Then, nothing." A ghost of a memory stirred in Myra's mind. She had never heard those words before, Yet something about them felt right, like an echo of something long buried. She swallowed hard. Someone's saying it again. Ronan's expression darkened. That means they're either a fool or they have a plan. The idea was staggering. Real resistance had been dead for decades. There were whispers, yes, but nothing organized, nothing that could truly threaten the Dominion's rule. And yet, someone had placed this message in Myra's hands. Someone who believed the fight wasn't over. She forced down the sharp thrill of hope trying to claw its way up her throat. Hope was dangerous. Hope got people erased. What do we do? She asked. Ronan exhaled, tapping his fingers against the side of the device. First, we find out who sent this. Then we decide if they're worth dying for. His voice was calm, but Mira knew what he wasn't saying. If they weren't worth dying for, then they weren't worth saving either. Mira took the watch back, feeling the weight of history settle into her palm. The chains had begun to rust. Now, someone was testing if they would break. The weight of the watch in Myra's palm felt heavier than it should, as if history itself had settled into its cracked frame. The message on Ronan's screen still flickered, the words staring back at her like an accusation. It's still ours. She had spent her life accepting that the Dominion was absolute, that survival was the only form of resistance left, that those who tried to fight back were erased so thoroughly that even their names became dust. But now, someone was whispering of something more, something buried beneath 3 centuries of silence. Mira forced herself to breathe, steadying the racing of her pulse. Ronan stood across from her, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. Whoever sent this, he said finally, knows exactly what they're doing. His gaze flickered to hers. And they know who you are. The words unsettled her in a way she didn't want to admit. You think it's a trap? She asked. Ronan's jaw tightened. If it were, we'd already be dead. That wasn't comforting. The Sarthian Dominion didn't waste time with warnings. They didn't toy with their prey. If they suspected her of anything, she would have disappeared days ago. Her name would have been erased from every record. Her apartment reassigned, her possessions incinerated, her very existence rewritten into something neat and efficient, like she had never mattered at all. So why this? Why now? Mira swallowed the unease rising in her chest. Then what do they want? Ronan picked up the watch again, running his thumb over the cracked glass. There's only one way to find out. Before she could respond, a soft chime echoed through the workshop. Mira went rigid. Her hand darted to the knife beneath her coat. Across from her, Ronan's fingers curled around the grip of his sidearm. Someone was outside. Ronan moved first, pressing a small panel on the wall. The door's locking mechanism clicked, the metal shifting just an inch. He peered through the gap, muscles tense, ready. Mira braced herself. Then she heard a voice she had long thought belonged to the dead. Are you going to let me in, or do I have to invite myself? The sound of Lillian Cade's voice nearly knocked the air from Myra's lungs. Ronan's expression didn't shift, but his grip on the door handle tightened. He glanced at Mira. The same unspoken question passed between them. Lillian shouldn't be here. Mira found her voice. You're dead. Lillian smirked. Not yet. She stepped inside without invitation, throwing her hood back. Her face was sharper than Mira remembered, her skin lined with the weight of years spent in the dark. Her once shorn hair had grown past her shoulders, and a thin scar traced from her temple to her jawline. But her eyes, those were the same. Defiant. Unbroken. Ronan shut the door behind her, locking it tight. If the Dominion knows you're alive. They don't, Lillian interrupted. And if we're careful, they won't. Mira couldn't tear her gaze away. She had seen Dominion enforcers drag Lillian away 6 years ago, hands bound behind her back, a rifle pressed between her shoulder blades. No one taken like that ever came back. Yet here she was. Mira forced her voice to stay even. Where the hell have you been? Lillian exhaled, her gaze dropping to the watch still sitting on Ronan's workbench. Something flickered across her face. Recognition. Familiarity. So you got the message, she murmured. Mira felt her pulse spike. You left this. Lillian nodded. Not just for you. She turned to Ronan. For both of you. Ronan stiffened. His wariness hadn't faded. Why? Instead of answering, Lillian reached into her coat. She pulled out a second watch, identical to Myra's. Same shattered glass. Same frozen hands. A chill passed through Myra's spine. Others have received them too, Lillian said. And this is only the beginning. Myra's throat tightened. What are you saying? Lillian met her gaze, steady and certain. I'm saying, she answered, that the war isn't over. Myra's heart pounded. There is no war. The Dominion won. Lillian's jaw tightened. No. They took control. That's not the same thing. Silence settled over them. Heavy. Unspoken. Mira shook her head. Even if there was a resistance once, it's gone. Erased. There's nothing left. Lillian smiled. That's what they want you to believe. Ronan folded his arms. Then prove otherwise. Lillian reached into her coat again. This time, she retrieved a small data chip. She placed it on the table, next to the watch. This contains the locations of 5 Dominion supply routes, she said. Unprotected. Unmonitored. Mira frowned. That's impossible. Lillian arched a brow. Is it? Ronan picked up the chip, turning it over in his fingers. His skepticism was evident. Where did you get this? From someone inside. Mira inhaled sharply. You have a contact within the Dominion? Lillian nodded. More than one. Mira barely kept her composure. If what Lillian was saying was true, then the Dominion wasn't invulnerable. Ronan set the chip down. And what do you want from us? Lillian's gaze sharpened. Help me. We can't do this alone. Mira hesitated. 4 years, she had stayed in the shadows. She had kept her head down, made herself invisible. She had survived because survival was all that had ever been possible. But now, the past had come knocking, and it was asking her to fight. Mira looked at the watch still in her palm. The cracked face reflected the dim light of the room, fractured and broken, just like the world around them. Maybe, just maybe, it was time. Mira had spent years convincing herself that survival was enough. That staying unseen, staying quiet, was its own form of defiance. Now, as she followed Lillian through the back alleys of Taros 9, she wondered if she had been wrong all along. The city pulsed around them, dim lights flickering in storefronts, steam hissing from the underbelly of factories that never truly slept. The air carried the scent of burning metal and something acrid, something that clung to the back of the throat like regret. Ronan moved beside her, silent but alert. He didn't trust Lillian. Mira didn't either. People didn't just escape the Dominion. Yet here Lillian was, leading them deeper into the shadows of the Undercity, her steps steady, purposeful. There was no hesitation in her movements, no sign of uncertainty. She wasn't lost. She knew exactly where she was taking them. Finally, she stopped before a rusted maintenance door. It looked like every other in this part of the city. Unremarkable, forgotten. She pressed her palm against the panel beside it. Mira expected an outdated biometric scanner, maybe a manual lock. Instead, there was a sharp click, followed by a soft exhale of air as the door released. The inside was nothing like the crumbling exterior suggested. The corridor stretched ahead, clean, its walls smooth and metallic. Recessed lights glowed faintly along the floor, casting long shadows as they stepped inside. Mira exchanged a glance with Ronan. This wasn't some abandoned hideout. This was built, maintained. Lillian, Ronan said, voice edged with suspicion. What is this? Lillian didn't answer. She led them deeper, past intersecting halls, past doors with reinforced plating that bore no markings. Finally, she stopped before one and pressed a sequence into a control panel. The door slid open. Inside, a dozen faces turned toward them. Mira felt her breath catch. They were human, but not like the weary, hollow-eyed workers above. They were fed, clean, dressed in gear designed for more than mere survival. Some wore utility belts lined with tools. Others had weapons strapped to their hips. They didn't look like rebels. They looked prepared. A man near the back stepped forward. His hair was silvered at the temples, his posture straight despite the weight of years on his face. Lillian inclined her head toward him. Commander, I brought them. Myra's pulse spiked. Commander? The man studied them, his expression unreadable. Mira Ardent, he said finally. And Ronan Voss. Hearing her name from a stranger's lips sent a chill through her. She forced herself to hold his gaze. Who are you? His eyes flickered with something. Recognition? Amusement? I knew your parents. The world seemed to lurch beneath her feet. Myra's parents were nothing. Workers. Names in a ledger. People who had accepted the Dominion's rule long before she was born. Weren't they? She tried to keep her voice steady. I think you have the wrong person. The commander smiled. It was not unkind, but it held the weight of knowing. No, he said. I don't. Ronan shifted beside her, arms crossed. We didn't come here for riddles. Lillian shot him a look, but the commander only nodded. You're right. You came for answers. He gestured for them to follow. The room beyond was a war room. A large display screen covered one wall, data scrolling in real time. Supply routes, Dominion patrol patterns, lists of names. Ronan exhaled sharply. This is Dominion intel. The commander nodded. Most of it comes from within their own network. Mira frowned. How? Instead of answering, he pressed a button on the console. The screen shifted, revealing a schematic of the Dominion's infrastructure. Our ancestors built the foundations of the Dominion's control, he said. Their factories, their networks, their systems. And despite what they want us to believe, they never truly erased us. He looked at Mira. They didn't erase you. Her fingers curled into fists. My parents were workers. They weren't part of any of this. The commander's gaze softened. That's what they wanted you to believe. Myra's stomach twisted. She had spent her entire life knowing that humans lost the war. That whatever defiance had once existed was long dead. But now, this man was looking at her like she was something more than a survivor. Like she was a continuation of something unfinished. She forced herself to breathe. Why bring us here? Lillian answered this time. Because you know how to move through the Dominion systems without being seen. Because Ronan can dismantle their tech in ways they can't predict. And because, she added, looking directly at Mira, you're already questioning the world more than you realize. Mira hated how true that was. Ronan exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. Let's say we believe you. Let's say there's actually something left of this fight. What do you expect us to do? Take on the Dominion? He scoffed. That's a great way to get erased. The commander's expression didn't change. It's already happening. The Dominion is weaker than they want us to think. He tapped the screen. You saw the supply routes Lillian gave you. Unmonitored. Unprotected. That isn't efficiency. That's overextension. Mira stared at the data. The Dominion had always seemed unshakable. An immovable force that had conquered Earth without resistance. But if that was true, why did these numbers tell a different story? Things are changing, the commander continued. They just don't think we're paying attention. Mira swallowed. And you think now is the time to strike? He shook his head. No. Now is the time to prepare. A long silence stretched between them. Mira felt the weight of 1,000 choices pressing down on her. If she walked away now, she could go back to existing. Back to moving unseen, keeping her head down, convincing herself that survival was enough. Or she could do something. She looked at Ronan. He wasn't committed, not yet. But he was listening. She looked at Lillian. And she thought about the watch. The small, fragile thing that had led her here. Mira took a breath. And she made her choice. Mira stood before the illuminated map, her arms crossed, her mind unsettled. The underground war room hummed with a quiet intensity, a current of purpose running through its walls. This place was not an idea, it was an operation. A rebellion waiting to ignite. The air was thick with the scent of old metal and static from the projectors. The Dominion supply routes pulsed in red across the screen, thin veins running through the Empire's body. But these weren't just transport lines. They carried people. Mira struggled to grasp the weight of that revelation. The Dominion didn't take prisoners. That had been an undeniable truth for as long as she could remember. Their enemies vanished, their names erased, their families reassigned as if they had never existed. And yet, this data told a different story. Ronan exhaled beside her, his fingers drumming against the table. It's a trap. Lillian arched a brow. You're sure? You think the Dominion lets transport routes like this slip through unnoticed? He shook his head. Either they want us to make a move, or this is bait for someone else. The commander, standing at the head of the table, remained still. His gaze didn't waver. That's a risk we're willing to take. Mira turned to him. Even if it means walking into a setup? The older man gave a small, knowing smile. They've been moving these prisoners for weeks. If they were setting a trap, they'd have sprung it already. He tapped the map, highlighting a pattern Mira hadn't noticed before. These routes aren't just unprotected. They're shifting, rerouted, inconsistently patrolled. That isn't efficiency. That's uncertainty. Mira frowned. You think they're scrambling? The commander nodded. Something is making them nervous. They aren't acting like an empire in control. Ronan narrowed his eyes. Then what are they? The commander let the silence stretch before answering. Desperate. Mira felt her stomach tighten. That wasn't possible. The Dominion had ruled for centuries. Their grip absolute. They didn't make mistakes. They didn't fear anything. Yet here they were. A hollow ache settled in her chest. She had spent her whole life believing the war was over. That humanity had lost. That the best she could do was survive in the cracks of the empire and hope she was never noticed. But what if she had been wrong? What if everyone had been wrong? Lillian crossed her arms. We don't know who's in those transports. But we do know this. If the Dominion is keeping them alive, they're valuable. Ronan scoffed. And you don't find that suspicious? Lillian's gaze darkened. Of course I do. That's why we're going to find out why. Mira looked at the data again. The route stretched across Dominion-controlled space, some crossing deep into territories too dangerous to navigate. The scale of it made her pulse quicken. She exhaled sharply. You want to intercept one? The commander nodded. Ronan shook his head. And you need us for that. Lillian met Myra's gaze. We need you because no one moves through Dominion systems like you do. You've spent years learning them, breaking them. You know the cracks in their network better than anyone. Mira hated how right she was. For years, she had been slipping between the gears of the Empire, staying one step ahead, disappearing before they could see her. She had never thought of it as anything more than survival. But now it was a weapon. Mira swallowed hard. How many people are on those transports? The commander's voice was quiet. We don't know. But if we don't act now, we may never find out. She clenched her fists. She had spent her life running. Now, she was being asked to do the opposite. Ronan exhaled, rubbing his temple. Say we believe you. Say these shipments are vulnerable. What happens if this goes wrong? The commander didn't hesitate. Then we'll know exactly how strong they still are. Mira met Ronan's gaze. His skepticism hadn't faded, but something else had crept in. Consideration. She turned back to the commander. When? His expression was calm, steady. 2 days. 2 days. Not enough time. But it would have to be. The transport rumbled beneath Myra's feet, its low hum vibrating through the metal floor. The air inside the cargo hold was thick with tension, the kind that settled into the lungs and refused to leave. Around her, the others were silent, waiting. 2 days had passed too quickly. She had barely slept since agreeing to the mission. Plans had been drawn, routes mapped, contingencies debated. But in the end, it all came down to this, the moment of action. She adjusted the strap on her harness and exhaled slowly, steadying herself. The stolen transport was moving along one of the Dominion's lesser patrolled supply routes, its security minimal enough that their infiltration had been too easy. That was what unsettled her most. Nothing about the Dominion was easy. Lillian sat across from her, securing the charge packs to her belt. You're thinking too hard, she murmured. Mira shot her a look. It feels wrong. Lillian smirked. It always does. Ronan, crouched beside the cargo door, checked the controls one last time. If we're walking into a trap, better to find out now. His voice was dry, but there was an edge beneath it, one that hadn't been there before. Mira could tell he wasn't just doubting the plan. He was doubting the outcome. The commander had made it clear, if the Dominion was truly unraveling, this mission would prove it. If they weren't, well, then none of them were leaving this transport alive. The thought sent a sharp pulse through Myra's chest. She had made her choice. She had committed. But fear still lingered, an old companion she couldn't shake. She clenched her fists, grounding herself. A light on the panel flickered. Incoming destination alert. Ronan exhaled. Showtime. The transport lurched, slowing as it neared the docking bay. Mira pressed her back against the wall, her pulse quickening. The plan was simple. Get in, locate the prisoners, get out. Simple never meant easy. The doors hissed open. Cold, artificial light spilled in, casting long shadows against the cargo crates. The docking bay was silent. Too silent. Myra's fingers hovered near her weapon as she stepped forward. No guards. No enforcers. Just the vast metallic emptiness of the station's loading area. Lillian's voice was barely a whisper. Something's off. Ronan moved ahead, scanning the area with a practiced eye. They're not expecting company. Or, Mira thought grimly, they don't need to. The team pressed forward, weaving between stacked crates marked with Dominion insignias. The station's corridors stretched ahead, clinical and unremarkable. No alarms, no movement. Then Mira heard it. A low, rhythmic beeping. She turned sharply. The sound came from a nearby crate, its lid slightly ajar. She exchanged a glance with Lillian before stepping closer, carefully lifting the panel. Inside, a tracking beacon blinked red. Myra's stomach dropped. Shit, Ronan hissed. They know we're here. A metallic clang echoed through the station. Then another. Footsteps. Heavy. Approaching fast. Myra's instincts kicked in. Move. Now. They sprinted down the corridor, weapons drawn. An emergency light flickered overhead, casting erratic flashes against the steel walls. The sound of boots, many boots, grew closer, too fast for them to outrun. Lillian cursed under her breath. They were waiting for us. Myra's mind raced. How? How had they known? The intel had been solid. The route had been vulnerable. Unless... She skidded to a halt. A door to the left. Reinforced, but not Dominion sealed. It had to be storage. Or a holding area. She made a split-second choice and slammed her palm against the access panel. The door unlocked. Inside, she ordered. The team spilled in just as the first shots rang out behind them. Ronan hit the panel again, sealing the door shut. Silence. Mira turned, and froze. They weren't alone. The room was lined with holding cells, the kind designed for containment, not comfort. Inside, figures stirred, blinking against the dim light. Humans. They had found them. A man near the front stepped forward, gripping the bars. His uniform was worn, his face lined with exhaustion, but his eyes were sharp, aware. He took one look at Mira and stilled. Recognition flickered across his face. Myra's breath caught. He spoke, his voice hoarse but certain. "You're Mira Ardent." The words hit like a blow. She had never met this man in her life. Yet he knew her. Ronan moved beside her, gun still raised. "Friend or problem?" The man exhaled, something unreadable flashing through his expression. "Depends," he said. "Are you here to get us out?" Mira forced her brain to catch up. "That depends," she shot back. "Who are you?" The man's fingers tightened around the bars. "My name," he said, "is Elias Ardent." Mira felt the world tilt. Impossible. Her parents had died years ago. She had been alone for as long as she could remember. But this man, this stranger, was looking at her like he had been searching for her. And outside, Dominion enforcers were closing in. The plan had just gotten a lot more complicated.